for this evening's program.
This is Bill Buschel, and you're listening to Graffiti. Prologue. Quang Tri Province, Vietnam, 1967. Lordy, lordy, it's July the 4th. Here we go again. Hot dog, hot time in the old town tonight. Bet we make big contact. I'm sure we're going to have an exciting day of fireworks. Enough, Hatfield. We don't need that. At dawn on the 4th of July, 2 battalions of U.S. Marines began to advance cautiously into the elephant grass south of the DMZ. The regulars of the North Vietnamese Army were waiting for them. The Vietnamese were dug in, well concealed, and supported by heavy artillery from North Vietnam, only a few miles to the north. And so it was that as the Americans pushed forward into the rising heat, Marines began to die. First to fall was Lieutenant Anderson of Kilo Company, 3rd Battalion, 9th Marines, shot in the head, leading his troops forward as they opened the battle by walking into an ambush. Anderson had never been much for taking cover. It's okay, God's going to protect me. By 11:15, when it pulled back 200 meters and artillery was called in to sweep the front, Kilo Company had suffered 12 killed and 17 wounded. They had not seen a single enemy soldier. As Captain Giles prepared to withdraw, a Marine lying in front of his hedge, thought to be dead, sat up slowly and lit a cigarette. "Are you okay?" "No, sir. I'm just having a cigarette before I die." "What I want you to do is roll over on your face and crawl back toward us." "No, sir. Just leave me alone. Don't come and get me. Leave me alone. I'm dying, and I want to have my last cigarette." Powerful imagery, powerful words. Words that drew me into Dr. JE Ted Lendon's book, Soldiers and Ghosts. After this music break, we will be talking to Ted Lendon about his book, Soldiers and Ghosts. John E. Ted Lendon has one of those resumes with so many accomplishments listed on it that I'm sort of at a loss as to where to start. How about in 1986 with the Wrexham Prize for the best senior thesis in humanities at Yale? A few years later, he followed up with the John Addison Porter Prize when he got his Ph.D. That prize is for the best dissertation in the humanities at Yale. Not bad. Now he's a professor at the University of Virginia, and in 2002, he proved that as well as being an important and great scholar, that he could also teach. And he did that by being presented the UVA All-University Outstanding Teaching Award. And recently, Yale University Press published his book, Soldiers and Ghosts. And instead of fumbling around with my own words, I'm going to take a quotation from one of the reviews of the book. And this is a review by Barry Strauss at Cornell University. And he says, Lendon's thesis is that historians have overestimated the influence of technology on tactics. Instead, he insists on the importance of politics, society, events, and above all, culture. And that's where we start. And we'll say, hello, Ted, and welcome to Graffiti.
Hello, Bill. Good thing we're on the radio, or I would have blushed during that presentation.
Well, you were meant to. You know, I butter you up in the beginning, and then I slap you around a little bit later.
That's fine.
First thing I wanted to talk about was the introduction I used. Up until about 6:30, I had actually wanted to do the beginning of Chapter 3, which is the quotation from Herodotus about Xerxes coming into Greece. Mm-hmm. That is so colorful that, you know, I said, but, you know, I chose this one for three reasons. First of all, because it is right at the beginning of the book. And it is, you know, the imagery is so incredible. And as I was reading it, I said, you know, this is a book that's history, but it was so dramatic that it just drew me right in. And the other reason was later on in the prologue, you make this connection between that incident and the ancient Greeks. So I was hoping that you could sort of make that connection on the radio right now.
Well, I'd be happy to. Connection sort of has two parts. The one is that the reason for that advance that is discussed in that prologue to the book is that they're trying to recover dead bodies from a previous day's engagement. So it has no real military function. It's merely to recover a set of dead bodies, and in the process a lot more dead bodies are produced. And this extreme concern to recover dead bodies, even when it might be regarded as militarily inadvisable, is something that the modern Americans share with the ancient Greeks. And so far as I can find out, not an enormous number of other societies share it to quite the same degree. And so it provided a good point of contact, it seemed to me, to show that although we think the way we fight is sort of modern and up-to-date and completely rational, in fact, we do a lot of stuff, too, which we do just because we're the type of people we are. Barry Strauss said in that review, my book is about culture and the way culture has an impact on how people fight. And so the second theme I wanted to draw out of that passage was exactly that we, too, fight in the way that our culture tells us to fight, even if that is not a particularly militarily rational way, just as the Greeks did, just as the Romans did, just as indeed all peoples have. No one fights in a wholly efficient fashion. You fight in the way that your culture makes you to fight. And we have those peculiarities just as the ancient Greeks did.
Yeah, I thought your example about not using poison gas was great because, you know, I just take it as being, you know, de rigueur that we don't use poison gas, but that's purely a cultural construct.
Yes, indeed, as is, for example, our reluctance to use dum-dum bullets. I mean, one of the peculiarities is that it's possible to purchase in the United States bullets with which you can shoot your fellow citizens, which the United States Armed Forces are not allowed to use in war. because dum-dum bullets were, at the beginning of the 20th century, it was decided that they were really too disgusting for use in war. And so they are generally not used, but as I say, you can buy such things if you like at your local gun store.
I think maybe we should take a moment to describe what dum-dum bullets are.
Dum-dum bullets are bullets which have a soft head, so that when they hit a person, they expand and create a particularly disgusting and damaging wound.
Very nasty.
Yes, indeed.
I'm going to ask you now the question that I usually ask first, but since the introduction was so important, I thought that I had better jump right to that first question. And the first question that I always ask, something that always fascinates me, is why people choose the path they've taken. When did you know that you wanted to be a classical scholar? Was there a turning point? Was there something as a child that excited you that made you choose this path?
It wasn't so much as a child. That's an interesting question, and of course one's history of oneself is always naturally a little bit false and fanciful, but at least as I tell the story to myself, I kind of knew that I wanted to be a historian in high school because I was so fired up with reading about history, and I was so inspirationally taught by my teachers of history. But then I expected that I wanted to study the Middle Ages. But then I got to university and actually began to read the works of the people who lived in those times, and I discovered that I had a much greater affinity for the works of classical authors, particularly Greek classical authors, who sort of, to a certain degree, dominate Western genius to an extraordinary degree, than I did for medieval authors. And so I began to read those texts, and I began to love them, and then I was converted to studying antiquity.
I have to say that Xenophon is one of my favorite authors. So.
Well, I'm afraid you would probably not be you would probably not be agreed with by most professors of classics who consider him something of a bore. But still, I enjoy him very much as well.
The book is broken down into two halves. There's the first half, which is about the Greeks, and the second half that's about the Romans. And I have to admit that I focused more on the first half. And I want to go back to that review by Barry Strauss. And a little bit further down in the review, he writes, "Let's sketch Lendon's arguments, beginning with the Greeks. Sketch is the right word because it is hard to do justice to the subtleties of his discussion. For Lendon, the evolution of ancient Greek battle tactics was not a case of better killing through technology. The Greeks did not follow a straight path of military efficiency. They were guided, rather, by culture, especially by the legacy of their past. Lendon identifies primordial competitiveness and reverence for epic as two main values of Greek culture affecting the evolution of battle tactics." And the other quote comes from your book, which I just, when I read it, I just went, wow, and knew that I had to ask you a question around this. And it's on page 37, and it's the quote, "The heroes of epic always sat invisible upon the shoulders of the Greeks, whispering their counsel." I just thought that was such a great image. But I think if the layman is going to have problems with the book, it's with the idea of the thesis that the importance of Homer's work and how influential it was on Greek society. You don't compare it to the Bible, and yet it has the weight of, I'm not sure what word I'm looking for, but it has an incredible weight and power in directing the cultural influences of ancient Greek society.
Yes, it does indeed. One could compare it to the Bible, but not, of course, the Bible now, because the Bible now is not simultaneously the major religious text and the major educational text. That was true, of course, in previous times, where one learned one's letters and a great deal of other things through reading the Bible, and that's very much what the Iliad in particular. That's very much the role it took. The Iliad was essential for ancient Greek education. Education was basically a question of memorizing the Iliad, or at least a certain number of the first books of it. And then whatever else you learned was taught in terms of that, so that when you were taught grammar, for example, all the examples were taken from the Iliad. And when later in your education you were taught rhetoric, the situations in which you gave speeches about were often taken similarly. Everything depended upon your knowledge of that text. And so whether or not you wanted to, it was always there, because every educated man had it essentially off by heart, at least the first 3 to 6 books of it. We know this because we can count the quotations made of it, and they tend to fall off badly after about the 6th book. Not everyone's education got that far. People read the rest, of course, but didn't necessarily have it memorized. But they certainly had a lot of it memorized, and it was a work of singular importance, because everything referred back to it. It's as I say, like the Bible would have been in the 19th century, rather than like the Bible is now.
Right. Is there anything comparable today that you can think of that people might identify with?
It's really hard. I mean, the only thing I could suggest might be something that everybody absolutely knows, and essentially knows by heart, would have to be something, I suppose, in popular culture like Star Wars, embarrassingly enough to admit, because I think at least my students know Star Wars a lot better than they know the Bible. But it's always possible when you have a group of people to use Star Wars as a metaphorical basis. Everyone knows what the Death Star is. Everyone knows who Darth Vader is, and things of that nature. It's of less importance,
right,
but it's of equal ubiquity as the Homeric epics were in ancient Greece.
Yeah, as you say, that certainly falls into the breadth, but not the specificity of the power, the intent.
Mm-hmm.
This is Bill Buschel, and you're listening to Graffiti on WNYE. This is Hellenic Public Radio, 91.5 FM, and tonight I'm talking to JE Lendon about his book, Soldiers and Ghosts, which is published by Yale University, and if you want to find out more, you can Google Yale University Press, or just type in Yale Books and you'll pop up on their website. We're going to take a brief musical break, and when we come back, we'll talk more with Ted Lendon about this wonderful book. Okay, we're back, and I just wanted to remind everybody that I'm talking to Ted Lendon, the author of Soldiers and Ghosts, published by Yale University Press. Ted, in the second chapter, The Last Hoplite, you talk about how there is change, but you also talk about how it manages to change in context that is consistent with epic. Can you talk about that?
Yes, well, the great puzzle when writing or thinking about early Greek warfare is how you get from the heroic individualism of fighting in the Iliad to the way in which the classical Greeks fought, which is all crammed together in a big block called the phalanx. There are a variety of explanations. Most of them unsatisfactory have been offered for this over time. What I think, it seems to me the evidence suggests, is that they're taking what the reason for the change is that they're trying to preserve the basic ethical satisfactions, or one could say competitive satisfactions of the Homeric system, whilst making it actually work in the real world. So that means in practice that you need a type of fighting which is not as chance-oriented as it is in the Iliad, and also in which there is a similarity between the experience of the individual and the experience of the state, which is also fighting. So they come together and fight in these blocks where an individual and the state have much the same experience, because you're pushing an enormous group against the opposition. So when an individual wins, he pushes the other guy back, and the state also wins at the same time. And so, to my sense, I don't regard the fighting in the Iliad as necessarily truthful or really descriptive of anything. It's a poem, of course, a work of literature assembled over a long time. But the important thing is that later Greeks thought that it was basically how they ought to live, and then they tried to put that into action. And they discover, of course, that you can't really fight like that, because in a real battle, the rule of the poem, which is that you can never beat a guy who's better than you, would not be true, because lots of guys would be beaten by people who were not as good as they were. So instead, they simplify things to produce this somewhat ritualistic style of combat, which has that effect that the better guy always wins, which is what they're looking for. So they keep the basic principle of Homeric warfare, the basic ethical principle that the best guy should win, whilst changing the actual things that they do, so as to be able to actually make that principle work outside the very forgiving circumstances of an epic poem.
I like the quotation that you have. Well, it's from you. I'm quoting you. This is actually in the next chapter, the two stubborn Spartans in the Persian War, and it says, the phalanx should not be viewed as a submersion of the individual in the mass, but as creating in mass combat a simulacrum of individual combat. I thought that was just a perfect description of what you're trying to present here.
Yeah, a phalanx should be thought of as a single gigantic hoplite. It's not really a form of impersonal combat at all. It's that everyone and the city have the same extremely personal experience, and we have difficulty thinking how such a method of combat could be heroic, because you're all crammed together there with your shield, pushing against the enemy. I mean, there's a wonderful depiction of this, in fact, in the new movie, 300, which some of your listeners may have seen. But the Greeks had no problem with that. They thought this was a very heroic method of fighting, which allowed individuals to prove their heroism and the city at the same time to prove its heroism, and therefore that it was extremely satisfactory.
Well, you jumped the gun on me. I was going to ask you a little bit later if you've seen the 300 and what you thought of it.
I loved it.
Bravo.
I have a terrible vice, however, for all of these sword and sandal epics. I tend to like them, even ones that aren't very good, like Alexander, which nobody, I don't think, except for me, liked. But I liked it a great deal, and I thought it was beautiful. I admired the graphic novel on which it was based before the movie came out. I've owned it and enjoyed it for a long time. And I thought that it was spectacular, incredibly exciting, and unlike some of my colleagues, I don't get tremendously wound up by the minor historical inaccuracies, because it strikes me, reading through our major account, Herodotus, that when he starts actually talking about the fight at Thermopylae, he starts sounding incredibly like Homer. So he's conveying it in epic terms. And if he's conveying it in epic terms, well, surely we have the right to convey it in our own epic terms. And that's what the filmmakers have done. No, I admire the movie enormously.
Great. I'm really happy to hear that, because I'm so afraid, that scholars in general are just going to poo-poo this film because of the reasons of the inaccuracies and the petty differences. But as when people ask me about it, and I say, but Herodotus had a lot of fiction in him.
Yes, exactly so. And there's a lot of complaining about, for example, how odd the Persians look. But then you go and read the account of there's a famous catalog of the Persian army in Herodotus, and that's at least as strange. There are all sorts of odd people, many of them completely impossible, in that catalog. So, I don't really have too much of a problem with some of the Persian army looking like they stepped by mistake out of a performance of a kabuki play. Because the point they're trying to convey is that this is a gigantic alien army made up of all sorts of types. And they convey that beautifully, and that's what Herodotus would have wanted conveyed. My question in a case like this, and it was also my question with the Troy movie, is would Herodotus have liked it? And would Homer have liked it? And my answer in both cases is absolutely yes. I think they would have loved it.
I'm not sure Euripides would have liked Troy, though.
No, I don't think Euripides would have liked Troy. But I think Homer, who is, of course, adapting this traditional material for an audience in his own generation, would have looked at this and said, look, they're adapting this traditional material for an audience in their generation. Bravo!
I agree wholeheartedly. One of the things I really like about it are the little nuggets that come out, and one of the ones that is in Chapter 3 is I found out why, for the first time, why it was an honor to be fighting on the right wing. It was the place of honor. And
that is where your shield does not extend.
Exactly, and I never knew that.
Operate with overlapping shields, and it's very scary to be out there. In fact, we're told that armies tend to nudge to the right as they go, as that man moves a little bit to try to make sure that he does not, in fact, have an enemy, that you want an overlap on that side, so that guy doesn't actually have to do anything. People move slowly in that direction, and therefore armies tend not to hit face on, but with a slight overlap on either side.
Yeah, so they actually drifted in order to...
Yes, exactly. They tend to drift, and both armies will drift to the right, which is, of course, different rights. So.
Yeah, right, exactly. The other thing that I found interesting was the whole theory or the whole discussion about officers not being obeyed, like how Xenophon had to cajole his men not to punish him for having beaten a few of the soldiers.
This was one of the great surprises of writing the book, because I really, when I began, had very little conception of how extraordinarily alien the Greek way of managing an army and command and things of that nature was. The Romans, of course, are much more like us. They have all sorts of intervening ranks, particularly under the empire. They have not only centurions, of course, but all sorts of people under centurions. They have a complete officer corps. They have a complete corps of NCOs and things like that. But what's astonishing about the Greeks is that, with the exception of a few peculiar armies like the Spartans, they seem to have gotten along for a very long time without any intervening authority whatsoever. You would have one or more, often a committee of guys known as the generals, and you would have the soldiers, and that would be it. And so there was the generals necessarily had practically no disciplinary authority because they had no one to help them do anything of the sort. But that seems to be, this is just one of those. That's just one of those things that you begin to figure out when you just look at the words and you wonder, what is the Greek word for sergeant? There isn't one. What is the Greek word for corporal? There isn't one. What is the Greek word for lieutenant? There isn't one. Basically, they got a word for general, and they got a word for sort of commander of a big slice of the army, and there's nothing under those guys.
Did all the great reviews surprise you?
Well, they're always very gratifying, of course. I was surprised in the sense that I had thought that the radicalism of the theory offered would have given more offense, and of course. We're now just starting to come out with the academic reviews, since they're a couple of years behind everybody else. And some of those people, I am gratified to tell you, have been offended. It's extremely pleasing when people get vexed at what you've written because it means they've read it. But no, I have naturally been extremely pleased. But as I say, I would have liked a little bit more. I love an argument, and I would have liked some people who just said, this is total nonsense, absolute rubbish from beginning to end, and no one seems to have thought that.
No, the reviews have been amazing, and I think what I found most interesting was that so many people said, this is great history, but it also should be read by the common man, the non-historian, the person who's just interested in either military tactics or, ancient Greeks.
Well, I have always, one thing that sort of separates me from many people in my profession is that I've always thought of history as a branch of belles-lettres, and therefore I try to express myself in a way that I find entertaining, and I hope other people will find entertaining as well. And I just wish more of my colleagues would do that. The public, the American public, has an absolutely insatiable appetite for history as long as it's nicely written and about things they're interested in. And you can tell that by going into Barnes & Noble and looking at the history shelves, when you quickly realize that the military history section is just as big as the rest of the history section, and the Civil War section is just as big as everything else. And when you open a book on the Civil War, you discover, wow, that really tends to be pretty well written. And so I do think that's a very important part of what I do. I try to tell a good story in an entertaining fashion, whilst obviously, telling the truth and advancing my case and things like that. But I don't think that a case advanced with simple academic argument is likely, in fact, to be as well received as a case advanced in a sort of entertaining style.
Right. Unfortunately, we're running out of time, so I'm going to sort of skip ahead a little bit, and I'd like to talk about Chapter 6, which is my favorite chapter because it's about Alexander. And I love the whole idea of Alexander and the epic, and, of course I know because of my readings, his attachment to Homer and, carrying the Iliad and putting it under his pillow and putting it in the cask and all that stuff. But I think one of the most interesting things that came out of this, and one of the things that I have always had trouble with Alexander was when he killed Black Cletus, or Cletus. And you put it in terms of everything is competition. Drinking is competition. Bragging is competition. And out of this, sometimes things happened.
Yeah. The people who led that army, Alexander and his group of friends, seem to have been, even by Greek standard, extraordinarily competitive. As they're marching along, Alexander amuses himself by practicing the Greek sport of jumping in and out of a chariot at high speed. And they, whenever anyone sees a bird, they all go pursuing it and shooting arrows at it. And whenever anyone sees a mongoose, they all go run after it and try to dig it out of its hole. And this sort of thing, I mean, it's really got a sort of fired up Boy Scout quality to it. Which is in many cases extremely pleasing, but particularly in the later years of the campaign, when Alexander is drinking way too much, it gets a little scary, and it's in that sort of context that you get, when Clytus says something rude to him, he kills Clytus, and is, of course, extravagantly unhappy about it subsequently. But when you set up a world in which everyone is competing with everyone else in that way, when that competition can easily come to a head. The Macedonians were a dueling people, unlike the Greeks beneath them, and that is they fought over questions of honor, and the Greeks in the city-states did not. Had given up doing that a long time before. So it's not surprising that you get manifestations like that in the Macedonian army.
Ted, unfortunately, we've run out of time. There were so many other things I wanted to ask you, but, when your next book comes out, you do have another book coming, don't you?
Oh, yes, indeed. I'm writing a book about the Peloponnesian War.
Excellent.
So I'll send you a copy.
Excellent. Well, Ted, I want to thank you so much, and thank you for the book. It's a wonderful book, and, I'm looking forward to the Peloponnesian War one.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night.
Okay, I just want to thank Professor JE Ted Lendon for coming on, and I also want to thank Alden Farrow at Yale University Press. See you soon. Kalinikta. May the eagles fly. Love ya.